Good afternoon. My name is Katie Schulman, and I'm proud to introduce our final panel of the day, Domestic Violence and Its Effects on the Family Unit. I would like to note that in a few minutes after I introduce our panelists, we will be playing a 1-minute video clip depicting a child who is in distress during an incident of domestic violence, which some may find upsetting. We would like to invite those of you who would prefer not to be present for the clip to take the opportunity to step out of the room before it plays. Additionally, there are note cards circulating which you can use to write down any questions that you have for the panelists throughout the program, and there will be event staff circulating who can bring those to the front for the Q&A portion of our panel. It is well known that women are disproportionately impacted by domestic violence. According to the Bureau of Justice, 85% of victims are female. Other calculations put that estimate at 95%. In the US, 1 in 4 women will be victims in their lifetime, and 1.3 million women are victims every year. Every 15 seconds, a woman is beaten by an intimate partner, and every 6 hours, one is killed. As concerning as these facts are, they do not begin to present the complexity of the long-lasting direct and collateral consequences surrounding the crisis of domestic violence. Domestic violence does not occur in the abstract or in a vacuum. It affects individuals, families, and communities. Women who are abused are much more than that. They are students and employees. They are friends, sisters, and daughters. Most importantly for today's focus, they are often mothers. The intersection of domestic violence against mothers and the intervention of the child welfare system raises particularly complex concerns. Here to share with us their expertise and energy are 3 wonderful panelists. Dr. Stephen Berkowitz is a renowned psychiatrist who specializes in work with traumatized children and their families. He previously spent 15 years on the faculty at Yale, focusing on the effects on children of exposure to violence. Here in Philadelphia, he serves as the director for the Penn Center for Youth and Family Trauma Response and Recovery. Today, Dr. Berkowitz will provide us with the scientific background regarding trauma and its effects, enabling us to have a trauma-informed discussion. Ms. Dorchen Leidholdt is an ardent advocate for victims of domestic violence. For 20 years, she has served as the director of the Center for Battered Women's Legal Services at Sanctuary for Families in New York City, the largest legal services program for domestic violence victims in the country. Ms. Leidholdt will share with us the perspective of the victim advocate. The Honorable Gail Garinger is the current and first child advocate of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, appointed by the governor in 2008. She previously worked for many years as a child advocacy attorney and after that as a juvenile court judge. Judge Garinger will share with us the concerns around domestic violence from a child welfare perspective. The video that I previously mentioned will now play, after which Dr. Berkowitz will begin his presentation.
Well, the computer listened.
following that. So I'm really going to focus on the effects of exposure to domestic violence on children. And I'm going to do that for two reasons. One, I'm a child psychiatrist. And two, I have 15 minutes. So it seemed like I should try to focus. Really quickly, some of the things that Katie already said, but I want to just add that the statistics are it's 15.5 million domestic violence incidents a year. You really can't hear me? Okay. Let's see. Do that. And about 7 million live with chronic domestic violence. So it's a huge, huge problem. 1 in 5 13 to 14-year-olds say that they know someone who has been hit in anger by a boyfriend or girlfriend. So this is something that affects not just adults, but our youth as well. And then the statistics are all over the map, but at minimum, we know that about 50% of families in which there's domestic violence, there's also child abuse. So that's, I think, a very, very important thing to take into account when we're talking about domestic violence, that it's about chaotic families with lots of problems and lots of issues going on. Importantly, when we talk about trauma in general and domestic violence, there are risk and protective factors. Age is certainly one of them. We know that the younger a child is, the more likely they are affected by intrafamilial violence. But also importantly that when you talk about children, you can't just talk about age. There are 12-year-olds who are mature, and there are 12-year-olds who, for all sorts of reasons, are developmentally 4. So it can have disproportionate effects depending on their developmental level and capacity. We know gender has differentiation in terms of effects, and I'll get into that more. Importantly, physical and emotional proximity are key factors. Seeing, witnessing, hearing, smelling make a very large difference. And obviously, in any traumatic situation, the closer you are to the individual who's affected directly, the more you're impacted. So domestic violence is a great and clear example of where emotional proximity is a crucial issue. Chronicity. We know that, and I'll get into that more later, but we know that there's a huge difference in terms of chronic domestic violence, chronic witnessing of just about any negative experience versus singular or otherwise. And then there are the child's innate characteristics, and those involve all sorts of issues, including genetics, capacity to have relationships with others and seek support from others, involvement in the community, and those sorts of things. So there are all sorts of different types of exposure that I think we need to take into account. So, hearing and seeing threats are obvious. But how about living in a home that's chronically tense, chaotic, where you just feel that stress and that anger all the time? There's the danger of being hit or threatened yourself. And in my work, I can't tell you how often I hear about kids intervening and being hurt during an assault that's occurring. Being denied care because of parental issues. Battered mothers are, not surprisingly, affected depressed often, traumatized, and not as available to their children as they may want to be, and for understandable reasons. Um, Seeing the aftermath of a violent incident. Yeah, I've had children walk into a home after school and see blood all over their house or their apartment. Um, Conflicted allegiance to one or the other parent, and uh, just imagine living with having to make decisions about which parent's right, who do you ally with, who's sometimes you ally with the one who's more powerful, who's stronger, right? Or the one who you're worried about. So this is a very complicated thing for children to experience. Um, Parents often list kids and put them in the middle of the situation. Isn't your father horrible? Your mother stupid? Things like that. Um, Being forced to watch or to participate, and that does happen. Uh, and then, of course, experiencing the loss of a parent, either to death um, or to the parent, being extruded from the family. Um, that may be the best outcome possible, but it doesn't mean it's not complicated for the child. And then just the general familial chaos and dysfunction that can ensue in domestic violence situations. One of the things that's really, I think, important to keep in mind is you'll often hear parents saying, oh, they weren't around, they were asleep, they were in the other room, they didn't know anything. And that's just not true. So children actually can provide very detailed accounts of what's going on. And 78% in one study reported witnessing domestic violence when their parents reported they had not. And then Jeff Edelson, who's really done some of the best work on some of the epidemiology, just like the film, that 21% of children called someone to help them during an episode of domestic violence. That's pretty large if you think about it, 21%. And that 23% somehow became physically involved in trying to prevent the violence. And then about half yelled or screamed to stop. So that says that they are, they know what's going on. And for those of you who are parents, you know that your kids know a lot more than you even want them to most of the time. At least I know that's true of my kids. Here are some of the common and possible effects. Generalized fear, anger, feeling isolated, low self-esteem, behavioral issues are rampant, anxiety, PTSD, difficulty focusing, learning disabilities and problems. Children who are exposed to domestic violence regularly have a dropout rate from high school of about 60%. Loss of trust, aggressive behavior. So we're really talking, surprise, surprise, about being traumatized. These are symptoms of being traumatized by experience. Also, we can't neglect that there's a lot of physical problems that trauma and exposure to chronic stress cause. And in fact, for those of you who are familiar with some of the more recent research, the adverse childhood experiences studies and whatnot, chronic stress is probably as responsible for many medical problems as it is for others. So cardiovascular disease is highly correlated with exposure to chronic stress in childhood, as is cancer, liver disease. But what we see in children often are headaches, often migraines, believe it or not, lots of stomach aches, ulcers are very common, hearing and speech deficits. And there's actually a recent paper really looking at kids who are exposed to domestic violence only, and I'm going to rush to domestic violence only, and it actually shows that the areas of the brain that are involved in auditory and verbal processing are significantly more affected than other parts of the brain. They are at very high risk for alcohol and drug abuse, juvenile delinquency, and of course injury. Real quickly, there are real gender differences, and one of the dilemmas that we see is that men learn to become violent, women learn to become victims. And I just want to highlight that the data is pretty clear that 82% of male batterers are exposed to domestic violence as children, and 70% of female victims were victimized as children. So this is a cycle of violence that many of us talk about, intergenerational violence. So people come into relationships already primed to be in these violent relationships. I want to this is a slide that I always love because we are, when push comes to shove, survival machines. Our primary job is to survive. And adaptations to violence is one way to ensure survival. And the way you do that is to become violent yourself. And that's been shown time and time again. You live in a violent, dangerous environment. The best way to manage it is to be violent and proactively and control the situation. And I think you can think of many, many examples around the world, and as well as in locally where that's the case. So the most complicated stuff is last, of course. This is the way we currently think about human development, and that the idea of nature and nurture is out the window. And we know that the environment and experience changes the brain. We know now the mechanisms by which genes are changed by experience. It's a field called epigenetics, which then has effects on brain architecture and brain development. And so we know that children who are exposed to domestic violence and other traumatic situations literally have traumatic brain injuries due to experience. And I think that's the best way that we can think about this type of exposure that causes injury to the brain. So basically, the brain's underdeveloped at birth. It has a very organized manner, bottom-up way of organizing. And to think about it as that genes are the basic blueprint, but experiences influence how they are expressed. One analogy is to think of genes as the brick and experience as the mortar. And that experiences don't have equal influence throughout development. The younger you are, the more the brain is malleable and the more it's impacted by experience. And the inverse is true. The earlier you intervene, the more effective you can be. So I actually did it right on time, right? So I do want to say that, just so a little bit of background, I went to lots and lots of crime scenes as part of a program called the Child Development Community Policing Program. That was nationally replicated. And you may not know this, but next to traffic accidents, calls for domestic violence are the most common call that police respond to. That shouldn't come as a surprise given its prevalence, but everybody's often surprised by that. But that is the second most common cause of a police call for service. And so Domestic violence work and domestic violence interventions are something that I've been doing for a very long time with children and parents and families, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Berkowitz. Now we're going to have Ms. Leidholdt and Judge Garinger have a chance to share. And Ms. Leidholdt, we'll start with you. Given your field and considering the scientific background provided by Dr. Berkowitz, what potential risks to domestic violence victims and their children most concern you?
Well, I think, and so I am the director of a legal services program for victims of domestic violence, as Katie mentioned. And annually, my organization, Sanctuary for Families, serves about over 10,000 victims of domestic violence. And our approach is very much an attempt to address the wide range of urgent needs of victims of domestic violence and their children. And we've seen that when we can do that, when we can meet the multiplicity of urgent needs, we can really help victims and their children extricate themselves from abusive relationships. So we're working with lots of victims every single day, and I think what potential risk most concerns me on an ongoing basis is really the risk of homicide to our clients and their children. And I think you felt it, probably everyone in this audience, when we heard the 911 call and the red marks on the neck. Well, that means that that mother has almost certainly suffered strangulation or choking, which is one of the major telltale signs, risk factors for a domestic violence homicide. And we know that not only are abused women at severe risk of intimate partner homicide, they are more likely to be killed by an intimate partner than by anyone else. I mean, Katie, I think your statistic that every 6 minutes, every 6 hours, a woman is killed by an intimate partner, and 1 in 3 homicides of women are by intimate partners. So that very much looms large. And I think what we're thinking about is we're thinking about risk factors. How to identify which women and which children are at greatest risk. And we know that abuse that is escalating, stalking, actually separation. And that's a really complicated one because we want victims and their kids to get safe. We want them to be out of abusive situations. But we also know that in that attempt to get away, to get safe, they're at the greatest risk of being murdered. So a big complicating factor, threats to kill, use of or access to weapons, drug or alcohol abuse, and battered or unemployment are huge risk factors. So sifting through those are of critical importance. And if I could quickly point to one more that was highlighted by Dr. Berkowitz in his presentation, I think it's the risk of disabling trauma and other psychological harm from PTSD to the kind of neurological damage that Dr. Berkowitz talked about, which we now realize counterintuitively that actually the littlest kids are at the greatest risk. We used to think that the baby in the crib is going to be okay because she or he isn't aware of what's going on, and actually it's the older child who's at greatest risk. And now we're learning that that baby is at enormous risk. And the risk, of course, especially for male children, of really emulating the perpetrator and then continuing the cycle of violence. But I guess that's what looms large for me when I'm thinking about risks to victims and their children.
And from my perspective, and I think it's been interesting talking with Dorchen over the last couple of days and hours, is that we're really coming at this from two different perspectives. We come together ultimately, but my whole experience, whether it was at Children's Hospital or as an advocate on behalf of children in the juvenile court, or it was as a juvenile court judge, and now as the child advocate, my primary lens has really been on the child and families involved with the child protective agencies. Unlike Dorchen's clientele, we talked, and she'll explain a little bit more, most of those are not families who are involved with the courts or involved with the Child Protection Agency to a heavy extent. Thinking on Dr. Berkowitz's presentation, I think, and picking up on what Dorchen just said as well, I think that I cannot tell you over my 40 years of being involved in this work, how often I have heard parents, professionals, others say, she was in the other room, she was asleep, she didn't hear a thing, no effect on the child. And as we're learning more and more about the brain development, we understand that it's those first 2 years of life which in some ways have the most significant impact on brain development. And we know from research that's been done, Lieberman among others, that infants as young as 3 months of age may show traumatic stress responses following direct exposure to trauma. And I think this really goes against our thinking over the years ago that it was that older child. It definitely was not that little one we had to worry about. I guess in the kind of work I do, I am most concerned about the intergenerational cycle of domestic violence. And again, with the cases with which I'm involved and over the years in my various roles, generation after generation of women who've been subjected to domestic violence, who, because of their experiences, choose partners who, again, subject them to domestic violence. And how do we break the cycle? And I think Dorchen's going to have some really good things to share with us because, quite frankly, that's the million-dollar question that after all these years, I haven't really come up with a good response to how do we really, really break this cycle? How do we intervene in a way that's going to lead to young boys and men, young men not becoming abusive, battering partners? And how do we empower women and give them the kinds of supports they need to make them realize that they don't have to be in these kinds of relationships?
And it's interesting because we all know, or many of us who are working in the field of domestic violence know that victims will leave and go back about 5 to 7 times before they finally can extricate themselves. And so recognizing that and not engaging in victim blaming because victims are going back, I'm always astonished at, it's when you're economically dependent on someone, when that person is the father of your kids, when you want your children to have a father in their lives, and when you know that it's going to be survival outside of this home is going to be so difficult, when you feel huge pressure from your, very likely your own family and his family as well to stay, to me it always feels like a miracle when victims can extricate themselves, and they do ultimately, given the right supports. And what are those supports? And I have the model increasingly is what I mentioned. It's multidisciplinary. It's the kind of multidisciplinary that we see on this panel. So it means experts in trauma-informed psychology and legal experts, like many of the folks who are getting trained at this law school, in the multiplicity of areas that victims need representation in: family law, immigration law, criminal law. It means a safe place to live, first and foremost. And then to be able to get out and stay out, it means economic empowerment, really. It means education and jobs and standing on your own 2 feet, as tough as that is to not be dependent on someone else for economic survival. So I think that's the answer. I know it takes money, takes resources, and I think we're seeing it in organizations around the country like Sanctuary for Families. We're just one of many. And also a model that we have in New York and in more than 70 other locations around the country, and it's the Family Justice Center model. And I'm a huge proponent of it. And what that means is it means that domestic violence prosecutors are put side by side with civil legal service providers, with trauma-informed counselors, with those with expertise in children. And just a quick point to make, at Sanctuary, we understand that victims need a lot of psychological support, but their kids do too, and those needs are not identical. And so often our clients, as Dr. Berkowitz pointed out, aren't aware of the extent to which their children, in fact, have been exposed to and affected by the domestic violence. But when we can begin to provide that kind of holistic safety net support system for victims and their kids, I think that that's the solution. And I think we're fortunate in New York that we have a lot of that going on. Not enough, but I think that that's the answer.
Judge Garinger, if you want to start with the answer for this one. Historically, what has been the approach that you have seen by law enforcement, courts, and child protection agencies? How have you seen that approach evolve over time? What concerns you about the approaches you have seen, and what is positive about them?
And in my 2 minutes or less, I think that we've seen a considerable evolution over the years, certainly, that I've been involved with child protection work. Prior to the 60s, early 70s, even into the late 70s, I think domestic violence from the perspective of the police was you would get a call from a neighbor, you would hear a loud noise coming from an apartment, you would come to the apartment and the man would usually answer the door, and you would say to the man, hey, quiet down. Quiet down. This is a family, but it's a family matter. We're not going to get involved. Just cool off, buddy. You've been drinking too much. Maybe you could go stay someplace else for the evening. There was very little attention paid to, I think, either the female victim or the children really taking a good look at what was going on and kind of taking the guy's word that, everything's okay. We'll chill. Then I became very involved, not so much with domestic violence, but in the late 60s and early 70s, Henry Kemp out of Colorado really started getting involved in recognizing and educating people about the problem of child abuse and neglect. But this was very much focused on physical abuse of children. And we actually, in those days, it went so far, and we have seen all these pendulum swings, which we'll be talking about. You had situations where a report of abuse would come in, a helicopter would literally swoop into a home, land on the lawn, whisk a child out of the home to be taken to a hospital for examination and intervention. And I'm not trying to minimize. We certainly want to make sure that children are safe, but we also know that that kind of traumatization of a child can be even more traumatizing than whatever was going on in the home, perhaps. So we had child abuse and neglect laws enacted in every state throughout the 1970s, but again, this was really not focusing so much on domestic violence. It was on physical abuse, sexual abuse of children. And it was really only very much of a cookie-cutter approach. There was just a sense that there was a way to intervene. You would file a report. Very often court proceedings were commenced to remove the child from the home. The mother was given a service plan, and this was what she was supposed to do. In the case of domestic violence, the batterer was to be ejected from the home. 2 households were to be maintained. The mother got a service plan. She was to engage in A, B, C, and D. Oftentimes the children were removed, but they were almost like waiting off in the wings. There was really very little work being done at times with the children to really understand how they individually, and all children respond differently. As Dr. Berkowitz said, it's not as if exposure, we can automatically understand what the effect has been on the child. We really need individualized assessments. Also, when I was a court judge, DV became the buzzword to some extent. And we could get a petition in the court that there was domestic violence in the home. I had no idea what that meant. Did that mean that there were loud verbal exchanges that produced anxiety? Did it mean that, it was a label, it was a conclusion, rather than really giving me the information I needed to help decide what was an appropriate kind of intervention. So I think that we're getting away from, we've seen a pendulum where it was a private matter, to we're going to protect children and heavily yank them out of homes, to now really trying to focus in on what can we do in the family, in the community, with appropriate supports, and other than those situations where there is such a dire need there's such a dire risk to the child that we need to remove. So I think we're getting into much more sophisticated, nuanced approaches, trauma-informed. I mean, we're hearing it on the lips of everyone, whether it's the police, the pediatricians, the social workers, the judges. I think we're all trying to get a better understanding of how trauma affects children, adults, and families, and how we as a society can best respond. Dorchen, do you want to?
Well, I completely agree with you that we've seen huge pendulum swings. And, you know, in terms of police and the courts, you know, the response initially was denial that there was a problem. And then if the problem became evident to the police or the courts, a lot of victim blaming. When I first arrived at Sanctuary for Families in 1994, what I was hearing was to a perpetrator, best case scenario was take a walk around the block when the police responded to this kind of a 911 call, or to the victim go to family court. Mandatory arrest laws were passed. There were lawsuits against police departments for failure to protect victims. And there were some well-publicized, horrific cases like, I don't know if you folks here know about the Tracy Thurman case, where the police watched as a young mother was battered in front of her child and stabbed, almost stabbed to death. And she ended up suing the police department and getting an award of, back then it was a large amount, $2.6 million. And so mandatory arrest laws being passed, prosecutors adopting first no-drop policies and then developing a whole new methodology of prosecuting domestic violence cases that don't depend on the cooperation of the victim witness. So a paradigm shift in our criminal justice system's response. And then in child welfare, I mean, that, when I first arrived at Sanctuary in 1994, what I heard from child welfare caseworkers responding to domestic violence cases was, it's not so bad. You know, just let them cool off. And maybe if you cook dinner a little bit better or, clean the house a little more, maybe it wouldn't be happening. And then a radical policy change, interestingly enough, dovetailing with the new political administration, where it was, when in doubt, remove. And we started seeing, my goodness, the doubt happened constantly, and kids were being taken away from their primary caretaker parents, if there was victimization, if there was domestic violence, put into foster care programs where they were often abused, and kids were being doubly traumatized, first by the exposure to domestic violence, and then feeling that they were responsible, that they were to blame for the fact, because they were then taken away from their moms. We ended up at Sanctuary for Families initiating a class action lawsuit against New York City's Child Welfare Bureau. And to me, I began to see the power of impact litigation. Fortunately, we had a great judge. The case, Nicholson v. Williams, and the court found that the Child Welfare Bureau of New York City was systematically violating the constitutional rights of battered mothers and their children. And by the end of the day, a very, very different child welfare response. We don't have so many cases at Sanctuary for Families where child welfare is involved in a negative way vis-a-vis our clients. We're seeing them often working with our clients to help our clients and their kids get safe and playing a constructive role. So the pendulum in the child welfare arena, in my view, has swung in a positive direction. I don't know if that's happening here as much in other jurisdictions, but I think it shows the power of advocacy.
Another thing I think to point out is you may have heard the term differential response. I think all of the child welfare agencies nationwide are really attempting to not, when they receive a report of abuse or neglect or possible witnessing of domestic violence, to really try to listen to what's being alleged, really understanding, maybe doing extended screening rather than quickly, screening in a report or screening out a report, and really trying to adjust the response of the child welfare agency to fit what the situation seems to be. Instead of an investigation, they may decide to do some kind of an initial assessment. And I think, again, it's looking at the particular family involved, the particular family members, to try to get a better understanding in domestic violence situations of what is really occurring, what has occurred, what has the pattern been, what kind of supports are in place, how can we strengthen a family, is there a need to remove any family member? And I just want to say for a minute, picking up on what Dorchen said, I think that we've really come to understand that this knee-jerk reaction of removing children, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard from kids and about kids who have been removed. They may have seen their mother injured, and then they're removed, and they are totally traumatized being in a strange environment. They're totally traumatized because they're worried about their mother's safety. And oftentimes, there are not immediate visits. It may be days, it may be a couple of weeks before that child sees his or her mother again, and they're constantly frightened that, is mom okay? Right. And until they really see her, that whole period is a new period of stress, anxiety, trauma that's inflicted. And we also obviously have come to know that foster care is not necessarily the best alternative for kids. We're trying to leave them with kin if they can't be safely left in their home with their parent. And we're really trying to keep them in the community and with familiar faces. So I think, again, we're getting better about understanding domestic violence and the intersection of domestic violence advocates with the child welfare advocates, and trying to figure out models of collaboration, consultation, bringing in the various disciplines so that it's not a quick legal response, it's not a quick necessarily child welfare response, except in situations where it's felt that, that's the only tool that really can keep a child safe.
Thank you. You've both touched on this already quite a bit, but if you could expand, considering the sometimes competing risks to victims of domestic violence and their children, what is the right approach, and is there a middle ground that protects both mothers and children?
I am actually going to probably defer a fair bit of my time to Dorchen on this one, and I think it's because, as I said, my primary lens is when child protective agencies are involved. And although we have developed more of a differential response, we're doing a better job, I think, of assessing the specifics of the violence that's going on in the home, how it's affecting the various family members. We're trying to develop other than cookie-cutter approaches in our child welfare system. In Massachusetts, I believe we were the first state to have a specialized domestic violence unit within our state child protective agency, so that social workers, supervisors who have concerns about a particular case have ready access to experts, if you will, in domestic violence with whom they can consult. We don't have nearly enough of them. We also have a witness to violence program at one of our leading medical centers. We also have a trauma grant that's looking at our 0 to 3 population, and in the context of that, certainly cases of domestic violence are coming to that group's attention. But I really think that it's through some of these other approaches outside of the child protection agencies that perhaps hold the better promise. So, Dorchen, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about that.
It's funny, I struggle a little bit with this question. Competing risks. The risks to victims and their children are very similar. Of course, first is the risk of physical harm. And of course, the greatest form of physical harm of death looms large, but also serious physical injury. And we know how lethal domestic violence can be for victims and their children. It's funny, I have some heroes in the field, and one of my heroes is Casey Gwynn and his amazing team over on the West Coast in San Diego. Casey Gwynn is the architect of both a new approach. Well, no, it's no longer a new approach. It's the approach for prosecutors called evidence-based prosecution, and of the Family Justice Center model. And they stress that just domestic violence intervention, the kind of ordinary domestic violence intervention that we're engaged in, should be considered homicide prevention, because that is such a big risk. And it's a risk. We have too many murder-suicides. We have too many instances where children are murdered with a domestic violence connection. We just had in New York City a mom and two little girls that were murdered together. So big risk. And as Dr. Berkowitz points out, the risk of physical injury to children is great. I mean, first of all, he pointed to the statistic that about 50% of the kids who are exposed to domestic violence are actually physically abused by the perpetrator of domestic violence. And then kids get in the way of the blows. Jeffrey Edelson's pioneering work shows that, I mean, kids intervene to try to protect the victim parent way too often. So the physical risk to children is as significant and as great an import as the physical risk to the moms, and we often don't focus on that. And then, of course, the huge and psychological risks to both that can really, for children, can be permanently disabling, and actually for the moms as well. So many cases in which we see our clients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which can interfere with parenting. Effective parenting can interfere with getting and holding a job. So huge psychological risks. And then I think I would point to the fact that the interests of abused women, who are almost invariably the primary caretakers of the kids and the children, really align up and should be seen as aligned. And I think that's what our child welfare bureaus around the country are beginning increasingly to recognize. And in terms of what middle ground is most protective, and I don't know if it's really the middle ground, but I think it's the multidisciplinary holistic approach. Of course we have to, and I think your point is so well taken, there have to be comprehensive individualized assessments in every single case. Sometimes victims can be perpetrators too. We have to recognize that fact. But I think what really can make the difference is the trauma-informed, multidisciplinary, legal and social services environment that is provided by organizations like Sanctuary and our many sister and brother organizations around the country, and the family justice centers.
And just picking up on that, I think I would mention that the incredible need for education of the public, education of all the various players, everyone, about trauma-informed intervention, whether it's school teachers who are seeing children. I have one case right now. It was a little girl who's 5, and it's a case that just came to our office, and we were concerned. One of the roles of my office is to oversee our child protection agency. I'm an independent office, and so we set up an interview in this particular DCF office to talk about why had they not removed a little girl where domestic violence was very, very prevalent. And the reason had been that the worker had formed a really strong alliance with the mother, to the point that she was really turning deaf ear and blind eye to what was really going on with the child. And we heard that the child was having all of the symptoms that Dr. Berkowitz described in a school situation, and yet the worker was not really talking with the teacher, was not hearing what was going on. So a little girl was hiding under the bed, who was finding new hiding places because there was also some physical abuse going on in the home. So I think it's a question of really heightening our awareness, and just, we've got to figure out a way to really communicate to everyone that violence is just not okay. I mean, it sounds so simplistic, but you think of all the major athletes, not all. You think of some of the major athletes, some of the major sort of public figures where they've been involved in domestic violence. And I think we're just not doing a good enough job of really standing up and saying that we have got to do something to stop this. And I'm thrilled to hear about Dorchen's program, but if any of you have any great suggestions with respect to the Child Protective Agency involved multi-generational families of how we can somehow, obviously intervene early, obviously try and break the cycle, but how? What's the best way, and how much money are we really willing to spend? Because ultimately, that's a lot of what it's about. And we, I think, are not spending our money. We pay lip service to we love kids, but when it comes to these kids, a lot of my kids who are involved with protective services, we just don't provide the money to give them the kind of intervention and supports they really need. So, sorry if I sounded preachy, but that's
Amen.
We've come to the Q&A portion of our panel. I have a number of wonderful questions that have been passed down, but event staff are still circulating if you have any others you want to hold up. This first question is not directed to anyone in particular, so anyone who wants to answer, feel free to jump in. When talking about domestic violence, much of the conversation is victim-centric and children-centric, as it largely should be. Following the logic of the law of specificity, however, what should we do from an abuser-centric perspective? In any form of oppression, we must care for and attend to the oppressed, but to deal with the cause, how are we caring for and addressing the oppressors?
What a great question.
I said out in the
It's what
hallway,
I was-
prepared. We need to think about how to respond to the question of usually the male oppressor, the male abuser. You haven't had much chance to respond. Do you want to say anything? We realize
As
he's
the only male in the group.
panelist of the day.
Well, the sad fact is that almost none of the batterer interventions have shown any effectiveness. I actually remember, 15 years ago, presenting with Oliver Williams, who was the proponent and really developed the model. 5 years later, when we looked at the evaluation, everything he thought he was doing didn't hold up. So the answer really is about prevention. It's early intervention and prevention where the answer lies. That's how you break the cycles, and that's how you work with the abusers. As someone who did a lot of work with families who were involved in domestic violence, these are not men who are very content and happy. I think we have to keep that in mind. And as I said before, most of them were exposed at least to domestic violence and probably some form of other maltreatment as children. And so it's really about that early recognition and intervention and support that is necessary. I also want to say one other thing that probably is nothing that we can do much about, but if I had all the money that we put into response, both judicial and clinical and otherwise, and we're able to give people livable wages with that money, which I think would be neutral, I think we would see a vast reduction in violence in the homes. And there's some pretty good data to support that, by the way, in several studies. So I think that there are some answers, but there's not the political will.
And I guess I would say, let's think about the money we may put into some other things, like maybe, military buildup, prisons. And it's very interesting who's in the prisons. Actually, it's not the domestic violence perpetrators who are in the prisons. These are almost always treated as very low-level offenses, and they're out within 24 hours. So I think your point is so well taken. Yeah, the jury is out on batterer intervention programs, even though a lot of resources continue to go into batterer intervention programs around the country, that they don't work. And certainly focusing on breaking the cycle early on, especially with boys who have grown up in violent homes. And I see very much the same thing in my practice. So many men who are batterers, and it's a small number of men who are batterers, but that small percentage are likely to have grown up in homes where they had very negative role models, their fathers abusing their mothers. Something else that we are thinking about increasingly, and actually we are hosting a panel Monday night, we're thinking about the good guys, or the ordinary men, the men who are not perpetrating domestic violence, and the critically important role that they can play in educating other men about the harm. So our panel is entitled Bystanders No More, engaging men in the movement to end gender violence. And we have 5 extraordinary men, including Casey Gwynn, the founder of the Family Justice Centers, an amazing man named Ted Bunch. If you get an opportunity, Google A Call to Men. He and Tony Porter are going around. They've educated everybody in the NFL and are educating men and boys on college campuses and high schools about the need to step up and speak out. But I think really engaging with men, this is no longer viewed as a women's issue. This has to be an issue that brings together men and women. And then one more Google Jackson Katz's TED Talk. And he's saying not just men have to speak out, but men need to be occupying leadership roles in this movement. And we're seeing that happen increasingly.
But we have to push it down to the preschool. We can't wait till high school. We can't wait till middle school. We really need to get in very, very early. Be trying to identify boys where it's clear that something is already going on in the home that's leading them to be acting out, and figure out ways to effectively try to intervene really early on.
This next question is about mandatory arrest laws. In states with mandatory arrest laws, female survivors will sometimes be arrested because of defensive wounds on the true perpetrator. To what extent do you think these laws help survivors, and do you think the benefit is worth the potential for them to be used against survivors?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I'm a big proponent of mandatory arrest laws, and I think the alternative to mandatory arrest is no arrest, in spite of all the work that we've done to educate police departments around the country. And once mandatory arrest laws began to be passed, of course, a big uptick in arrests, mostly arrests of domestic violence perpetrators, but too often arrests of victims, and sometimes victims acting in self-defense. And the response was for states to pass laws called primary aggressor laws that require police responding to 911 calls to make primary aggressor determinations and to consider some pretty obvious factors, like are the injuries defensive, or is there a history of domestic violence in the household, and who is the perpetrator? Were there previous 911 calls? So I think mandatory arrest is essential, but the solution to preventing the wrongful arrest of victims is intensive, force-wide training of police officers. Police officers have to make some very complex and sensitive determinations when they respond to a 911 call, and they often don't receive the training and the support they need to respond appropriately.
I should add, as someone who trained police quite a bit, one of the things that we were able to institute in a lot of jurisdictions was rather than arresting both when it wasn't clear, and sometimes it's not, was to look at the least detrimental alternative, arrest one, and then do what we call a promise to appear citation to the other, so that while you were still protecting the child by keeping one of the parents in the house, which I think was a very important change as a result of some of these problems that occurred. And I think it at least generally worked out quite well.
Often child welfare investigations are done by the least experienced staff who may not be trained in social work or therapeutic interviewing. How can we restructure these interventions to better screen women, children in at-risk settings?
I'll tackle that one. I think it's a major problem. I think that certainly I'll speak primarily for Massachusetts, that our frontline investigators, while they do receive training, they often are relatively young, relatively inexperienced social workers. And the differential response, while I firmly believe in it, I think has really perhaps left some children in homes where they really are in harm's way. And I think that, again, the education that needs to occur, it's not just in a classroom, a 1 day or a 1 week kind of instruction. I think it really does require cross-training. It requires the input of child therapists, child psychiatrists, the police ideally, teachers. I mean, I really feel that investigators have been perhaps focusing too much in recent years under differential response to not really first and foremost going in, from my perspective, and asking, is a child safe? Is the child safe in this present constellation? Is there a way, short of removal, that we can do our best to ensure the child's safety? Is there a kin who can be temporarily used as a respite, a kin placement that is known to the child? But I think that the investigators, there just isn't enough understanding still about domestic violence and what we're looking for and how do you assess. What kinds of tools do you use to do risk assessments? And again, once you document or substantiate a case, that's a part, but then what are you going to do about that? That's to me, the more important question. It's not just checking the box of whether your report was supported or not when you did your investigation, but what kind of intervention is going to be most helpful to this child and family.
All right, I'll add my 2 cents. I think, again, it often goes back to what are we willing to pay for? I think about daycare centers as an example. Some of the lowest paid people that I know are those people who are taking care of our kids in daycare centers. That's also true in the child welfare world. This is some of the hardest, most difficult work imaginable to make these decisions. And look what the frontline workers get paid. Look what their experience is. Look what they're expected to have as degrees. What kind of training do they get even before the job? Those sorts of things. It's a real issue. That, again, how do we think about what matters, and what do we pay for the most important people in our future? And we tend to neglect that.
I just want to say one quick thing, Katie, is that our Massachusetts child welfare system, our whole sort of child protection system is in a bit of, I call it disequilibrium right now. I don't know if you've heard that a 5-year-old boy who's now presumed to be dead was an open case with our Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, and he was missing, and he is still missing, presumed, as I say, to be dead. But because of high caseloads, because of competing demands, this was a child on an open case who wasn't visited for 7 months. And last involvement of the social worker was 7 months ago. And it was only through a disclosure by a sister at school that she hadn't seen her little brother in a long time that led to this. So we are in the throes every day in the paper since Jeremiah disappeared on December 13th. It's been a frenzy of the media, a frenzy of the legislature, trying to call, the question of what are we doing with our child protective sort of agency. And we come back to, we faced lots of budget cuts with the recession, lots of cutbacks of social workers, lots of cutbacks of managers, reductions in trainings, reductions in development of policies and protocols. And I just think that our whole, not just in Massachusetts, but our whole country really is rethinking child protection and what are the agencies all about? How much are we willing to pay for that kind of work? And just one more thing, and I'm sorry, is that one agency can't do it all.
Right.
We as a society, if we really care about our kids, it's got to be everyone. It's got to be everyone, from the people doing early intervention to the playgroup teachers, to the pediatricians, to the doctors, the police officers. I mean, we really all have to come together and say, we want to protect children, and swooping them from homes isn't the answer. We don't want to leave them in unsafe homes, but we have to find ways to really, it sounds a little trite, but the village approach, we all have to take on, that we care about our kids, and we've got to put our money and we have to put our actions into play to really do what we can to protect kids and to give them the kind of healthy environment, hopefully in the context of their family, that can lead them to, break the cycle and get on with productive, successful lives. So.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for Q&A, because I do want to give the panelists an opportunity to share some final thoughts, but there were a lot of lingering questions, so hopefully you can address those personally with the panelists if they have any time to stick around. At this time, starting with Dr. Berkowitz, if each of you could just share any final thoughts that you have that you'd like to share with the attendees.
Well, I think it's been said, but I really do believe, and I have seen in my own work, that it is about multiple disciplines working together closely and really forming relationships. I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about is we often do this, I teach you how to do this, rather than we're working together and teaching one another. What do I know about what a child protective service worker's job really is on a day-to-day basis? I need to go to their office, and their office is in the street, and they need to come to mine. And we need to form these really close bonds and relationships in service of the work. And I think we don't do that very well. Sometimes when we do, as you have discussed, it really produces some really remarkable outcomes. And I think we really have to get into the trenches together, no matter who we are, and create those relationships in service of children and families.
I guess I would focus on the fact that historically, I think that the interests of children and the interests of domestic violence victims, and actually so many children are domestic violence victims when you really think about it, have been seen as being at odds. And I think that's been a huge problem. There's been a split often between children's advocates, lawyers for children, the child welfare community, and domestic violence advocacy organizations and leaders. I think it's been an enormous mistake, and I think that's beginning to change. I mean, we saw it change in our lawsuit, Nicholson v. Williams, where we had the Juvenile Rights Division of the Legal Aid Society and Lawyers for Children on our doing amicus briefs in our case, saying this is really harmful for children to be removing kids from their primary caretaker parents simply because they've been victimized by domestic violence. So I think bringing these two really critically important advocacy movements together is happening and is long overdue.
And I think I made my final pitch prematurely. So I want to thank you all. I'm sure Katie will too. I think you've been great, and it's been a really good day, and it's been an honor to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Berkowitz, Judge Garinger, and Ms. Leidholdt, for sharing your perspectives and your knowledge. If any members of the audience are interested in learning more, please see the materials that are circulating, and if there are any extras, they'll be available down at the front of the auditorium. Please join me in giving our panelists one more round of applause. As I close out the 2014 Spare Symposium on behalf of my colleagues, the other class of 2015 Toll Scholars, we hope that you leave today with a better understanding of the obstacles that persist on the path to achieving gender equality, and also a sense of what you can do to make a difference toward that end. As Erica Young eloquently said in a clip from our opening video, just as democracy tends to evaporate when you stop fighting for it, feminist gains tend to evaporate when we stop fighting. We hope that today has renewed the desire to continue fighting for gender equality and stirred up conversations that will not end when you leave this room. I have a quick reminder, which is to be sure to complete your CLE paperwork for those of you who registered for credit, and you can pass it in right outside the doors where you registered. And finally, we want to extend a huge thank you to the many people who made this day such a success. Thank you to our inspiring panelists and our keynote speaker for lending us your time, your passion, and your expertise. We also want to thank the Toll Public Interest staff for their help and patience over the last year as we planned today's event. We want to thank the law school, from the administration to communications to facilities and IT, for all the support that they provided. Thank you to our wonderful student volunteers who helped the day run smoothly. And finally, thank you to all of you, our attendees, for breathing life into this day with your energy and your participation. And with that, we welcome you all to join us for a reception just up at the top of the stairs in the GOAT. Thank you.